This is Strength to Strength Books, and we welcome you here for a review of this book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, The Improbable Rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, and the author is Alan Kreider. At Strength to Strength, it is our vision to offer resources that strengthen your obedient love-faith relationship with King Jesus and give you solid footing in a shaky world. And we believe that as we look at church history, that it'll give us a way to move forward, especially in our world today. And this book, we believe, will offer us many resources, many insights, and it'll inflame our imagination on what could we as a church today, how could we relate to the world around us as we mine out the resources and the teachings of the early church. This book is not a dry academic read. And as a little bit of a teaser, author Alan Kreider makes a case that the early church didn't have any missionary strategy, which is incredible in light of its growth. At the beginning of the first century, there was no church. And by the end of the century, followers of the way were in every place. Alan Kreider's recent book on church history, Resurrection and Reformation, he says this: Christians by the year 100 had begun new congregations in every part of the empire. Many of these were still in their infancy, with very few members, but they were there and they continued to grow. This growth happened because believers obeyed their Lord, taking with them the good news wherever they went. They went with the Spirit of Jesus, never using violence or force to bring people into the church. That is not to say that the early spread of the gospel involved no bloodshed. Many believers bore the marks of persecution in their bodies. Many others died. But the gospel of Jesus, the Prince of Peace, penetrated the entire Roman Empire peaceably, with no believers shedding blood of others or using force. And so Rodney Stark, another early Christian historian, says this. He said that the early church grew about 40% every decade. The odds were stacked against it, but it grew. He goes on to say, Christianity revitalized life in Greco-Roman cities by providing new norms and new kinds of social relationships able to cope with many urgent problems. To cities filled with the homeless and the impoverished, Christianity offered charity as well as hope. To cities filled with newcomers and strangers, Christianity offered an immediate basis for attachment. To cities filled with orphans and widows, Christianity provided a new and expanded sense of family. To cities torn by violent ethnic strife, Christianity offered a new basis for social solidarity. And to cities filled with epidemics, fires, and earthquakes, Christianity offered effective nursing services. And so at Strength to Strength, we believe that the church is God's plan A for changing the world. And in this circle of brothers here, I'm confident that these brothers believe that as well. All of them are involved in different ways in reaching out in their communities. Stephen Brubaker captures this so well with this quote about the church. The divinely resourced organism for withstanding tsunamis of moral degradation is the Church of Jesus Christ, a church anchored in 2,000 years of faithful doctrine and practice, a church receiving with gratitude the wisdom that precedes it, a church built on the grace of the past is in the best position to not only withstand, but turn back the shadows of evil and injustice to prevail against the gates of hell. And so our goal is to look at the apostolic church as the New Testament church, as the faith once for all delivered to the saints, to look at that as the answer for our day, the Church of Jesus Christ, and then to look at the early church as commentary on how we can live that out in our world. And so we're going to be digging in this book here this evening. We have, obviously, as you can see, three other brothers here on the call. We have Kevin Shank, is joining us here from York, Pennsylvania, and he is part of the church called Tidings of Peace. Is that right, Kevin?
Correct.
Kevin grew up in that city. His father, the late Clayton Shank, has been an inspiration to me in the past in his desire to see Anabaptist churches planted in cities. Also joining us is Wendell Martin from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, part of the Disciples of Jesus congregation. It's good to have you here, Wendell. Wendell
Hey,
also is
good
part of the
evening.
admin team for Strength to Strength. And then also Hector from State College here. Hector, as some of you might know, wrote a book called Jesus and the Mennonites. And in that book, he draws from this book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. So Hector and Kevin and Wendell, good to have you here. I'm looking forward to doing this book review with you. What we've done is we've taken some of the kind of the four topics that are addressed in this book and passed them out here among us. So um, Kevin will kick off here with looking at the topic of patience, and then Wendell will look at the topic of habitus, the embodied behavior of the Christian, and then also we'll look at how the early Christians assembled, and that would be Hector, their worship services, and then finally the word ferment that's used in the title here. I'll talk a little bit about that. So, Kevin, we'll turn to you here. Kevin, tell us a little bit about why. Why do you think this book is important for our day? How has it inspired you? And then hop on in and tell us a little more about this this particular idea, this idea of patience, and why Alan thinks that the early church embodied that and cared deeply about that.
Sure. So, thanks for having me. This is great. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to this discussion. In terms of why this book is important to me, it's part of that is an irony. I don't think that a book about patience presents itself as the best candidate to really blow open your worldview and turn some things upside down for you. But that's exactly what this book has done for me. And for that matter, there's been a ferment. I first read this book about 2 years ago, and I continue to digest what I read and to return for inspiration. And so I think you stated well why it matters. The other thing that the book says on the back cover is a timely history for the church in our secular age. And I would say, amen. There's so much here. So, anything more you want from that?
Nope, that sounds wonderful. But Kevin, you're somebody who has isn't necessarily a patient person. I think I've heard you say as well, and so this has challenged you in terms of, especially when you think of evangelism, right? Of reaching it.
Right, precisely.
We want to see great things happen right now.
Right.
And maybe
There's absolutely an irony here. There's an irony that I'm here talking about patience because I have not been a patient person. I have not been formed as a very patient person. And so it's been my prayer and desire that that would change. And this book has certainly been seminal in that regard. It's been absolutely phenomenal in challenging my worldview. And that's really where I want to end this presentation on patience. So we'll circle back around there.
Sure.
But first, I just want to say this book is aptly named, and there's many, many careful things about this book. But I think from the title on through, the fact that it starts with patience is accurate. Patience permeates every part of this book. And so I'll give an introduction here, and I'm sure that my other brothers here, if they're doing justice to their topics, will be talking about patience as well, because it really is phenomenal. It's impressive how much patience fits as a interpretation of the history of the early church. But I'll start where Alan Kreider starts with the writings. And this feels like a fitting introduction, a fitting place to start for several reasons. Number one, Alan points out that the best surviving literature of this era that we're looking at in the early church is Christian literature. And so it's not that Christians didn't write, it's not that they didn't write passionately and write well. They definitely did. But as we look at these writers, and the writers that he especially focuses on here are Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Cyprian, and Lactantius. And that takes us from the first to the fourth century, end of the first to beginning of the fourth. And these are prolific writers. We have quite a bit of their work remaining to this day. And they either wrote treatises on patience, or patience just permeated their work to the point that if they were writing about other character qualities, they were basing them on the quality of patience, as saying all character springs from patience. And so in Kreider's very careful review of this history and this time period and what these leaders are writing, he finds that the subject of patience is unavoidable. But it's also impressive, and you alluded to this, Bryant, that there's just an incredible, surprising lack of things that we would expect to see for a organization to be successful based on our Western worldview. There's lack of instructions on how to convert pagans to Christianity. There's lack of strategy. There's hardly even mentions of evangelism. Rather, there's a grave concern with how does transformation look? What does integrity look like in our lives and in the life of the church? And there's also a double irony here, because one of the quotes from the early church that really captures so much of what Kreider is trying to bring out is this statement by Cyprian: "We do not speak great things, but we live them." So they were far more concerned with lives that were well lived than with words, even though they also produced the best literature of the time. But it was incredibly focused on this thing of a life that is well lived. So as we think about what did they write, I want to use that as a springboard to talk about the theology of patience that emerges from this time. So the subject and their treatises on patience start with the commands of Christ. So we start with the Sermon on the Mount. What did Jesus say about how we should live in this world? And many of these commands are quite obviously linked back to patience, especially when it comes to nonviolence and how we respond when we're not being treated well and things are not going well. And so we are patient, number one, because Jesus told us to be patient. But we don't stop there, and the early church writers didn't stop there. They also continued to develop this subject and talked about following the example of Christ and the way that Jesus embodied patience in his life. And because he embodied patience and willingness to suffer and not being in a hurry, then we should do that as well. And then further, patience seems to be the character quality of God that was most clear to these early Christians. They stress the character of God as the character of patience, which is really interesting, because I would have said the character of God that's most obvious is love. That's what we talk about most frequently, and I think there's good reason for that. But in terms of the patience of God, I was interested in how often the verse comes up from the end of Matthew 5, where it talks about God sending rain on the just and on the unjust. And I find that very interesting, because that is the statement that immediately precedes Jesus' instructions for us to be perfect, right? Be therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And when the early Christians are looking at this, they're saying, oh, this is talking about being patient. And so it almost seems like we could say, be patient, even as your Father in heaven is patient. And I want to revisit that again just a little bit. But moving on from the theology, we could hardly say enough about the practices of patience that were evident during this time in terms of willingness to suffer, commitment to nonviolence, as was already mentioned, but also that transformation takes time. They realized that transformation takes time and that transformation was an important part of the work of the church, and they embraced that need for time. They embraced taking time. And it didn't take long until the church developed very lengthy processes of catechesis to help pagans become Christians, not because they were out campaigning that they do so, but because people were actually fascinated by the church. And also that the church grew in a patient way, as I already alluded. It wasn't focused on growth; it was focused on transformation, and so there really was an emphasis on the foundation and building up from there. Much more can be said about all of these things, and I expect that we'll get into it a bit more. Another thing about patience that I find fascinating in this book is that it's used as a historical lens. So when we're talking about the early church, we're talking specifically about the first 300 years of the church. And the reason for that is because there's a very natural bookmark there when Constantine embraces Christianity and the church starts to change very rapidly. And so we have a new era of the church following Constantine. But in this first 300 years, there's an emphasis on patience. And then these changes that are occurring, and when we're trying to understand the changes, Alan gives us a lens to say that the change Constantine brings is impatience. He is the impatient convert. He's the one who is attracted to what he sees in Christianity, but he's too impatient to embrace the patient lifestyle for himself. And so he waits until the last minute so he can live out his impatience and then still get the faith in the end. And that sets a pattern for how Rome then at large follows and embraces Christianity in many parts. And that brings a different character into the church. He further builds this out by talking about Augustine and the way that Augustine starts to embrace impatience in the church as a leader, and the way that he has a new ideas about patience, which in effect negate the patience that had been taught by the church up to that point in time, like the use of force and like the use of strategy for growth and so on and so forth. I would say that this book itself, and this is just a promotion for the book, I think this book is a work of patience. This is Kreider's final and seminal work. It's thoroughly researched. He demonstrates a thorough grasp of the materials. It's notated exhaustively throughout, and yet he engages so gracefully with people that he disagrees with. And it's riveting, it's engaging, it's a worthwhile read. It's not dry academic, as was said. But I want to end here with this emerging reality for me of patience as a worldview. So I talked about the passage from the Sermon on the Mount, but probably the piece of scripture that has been most provocative for me following reading this book comes from 2 Peter 3:9. It says, "The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is patient towards us, not willing that any should perish, but all should come to repentance." So I would say for the first part of my life, I would have emphasized that God is not willing that any should perish. And when you start to connect that to our part of bringing the kingdom and doing the work of the kingdom, that can easily feed into an idea of a high pressure faith and high pressure Christianity and focus of the church. But interestingly, when Peter uses this statement about God, he's using it to explain why things are not moving faster, why things are not happening at the rate we think they should happen. Because he's talking about people who are saying, well, when's Jesus going to come back? If he hasn't come back yet, he never will. And so what's really interesting about that is that suddenly patience becomes both actually an explanation for why things are the way they are. Why is this world the way it is? Why hasn't Jesus come back yet? Why are we still here carrying on? Uh, it's because of the patience of God. That's what Peter says. And so when you look around you, you think about your own life, you think about the things you wish were different in the world, and you ask these same questions to Scripture, the response is because God is patient. And because God is patient, he is not coercing anyone. He is willing to take time. He's gentle towards our weakness. He's large and loving enough to heal us from our wounds, most of them self-inflicted, right? And so patience provides an explanation for why things are the way they are. It also provides a litmus test for if I want to proceed in my life or my church with the character of God, then it's got to pass the patience litmus test. So I think that Kreider succeeds very handsomely, both in drawing a very thought-provoking and compelling picture of the inception of the church formed in a womb of patience, and also he invites us to recapture that quality in the church today. And I hope that will be true.
Sure, yeah. And I'll just open it up here for Wendell or Hector right shortly to ask any questions. One thing I was going to mention at the beginning is that Alan Kreider is the late Alan Kreider. As I understand, he died a year after this book was published, which I think this book was published in 2016, I believe. Alan was a professor at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, in Indiana. He studied at Goshen College, at Princeton University, at Harvard University, at University of London, and his studies focused on the early church, and kind of around the question of how did the early church grow. And I know that he had some other books. I think one book is called Alien Residents. This idea of the church had this pilgrim and stranger sense to it, and he pulls this out in the book as well. So I had mentioned it at the beginning about Alan. So thank you, Kevin, for those thoughts. And this idea of transformation takes time, patience, that being the strong point of those early followers of Jesus, those early Christian communities. One of the things that I grapple with is when I hear patience, I quickly fear slothfulness, or just like, just chilling, and just not being busy about our Father's business. It almost seems like
Mm-hmm.
those two kind of go hand in hand, or I'm fearful of that. So maybe help me understand, how can I ally my fears there?
So you could use the word slothfulness, or you could say indifference or lethargic, or
Okay,
right,
sure.
any number of things that
Hmm.
we're taught to fear. I think it might be worth repeating again this quote that Cyprian used. We do not speak great things, but we live them. So uh, evidently, throughout these histories, as we look them up, the early Christians were not sitting around just waiting for Jesus to come back. Right? There was a very keen interest in how life ought to be lived. But yet, I think the reason I like the idea of a litmus test is because I think when it comes to evaluating these questions of how ought life to be lived in all reality, patience is not an excuse. It's a means of evaluation. Does this fit the character of God? And I think there's an irony here, right? Like there's a paradox, which Jesus is all about paradox, right? So there's a
Mm.
paradox that a patient community is one that is more likely, in all reality, to provide a context of belonging and healing and transformation, rather than one that is high pressure and overwhelming people. And that's not hard
Amazing.
to understand, but
Hmm.
it gives us a lot to grapple with.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Wow. Yeah, I mean the idea of as I've gotten older and just realized that um I'm just not as sanctified as I thought it might be at 42, you know. I struggle with different things, and I just realized how patient God is and how patient those around me are with me. And it is such a beautiful attribute of God and of other believers is this patience. And as we can exhibit that to others, it is such a beautiful testimony because yeah, we live in a very impatient world.
Hey Kevin, I really liked your bringing out there the scripture from Second Peter 3, God's patience. That's a great way to think about that. Um, the difference between not willing that any should perish and the fact that the reality of that is because of his patience. So I like that. And I was going to ask you the question too, basically the same question Bryant just asked. So you got to it before me, Bryant. Thanks. Yeah,
Is there
this
anything you
really
would add to that, Wendell?
what's that?
I said, is there anything you would add to that?
I don't know. Other than that, um, the difference between patience and laziness. I was going to ask, what's the difference between patience and laziness? Like,
Yeah, there's one more thing I could add.
yeah,
So in studying the New Testament uses of the idea of patience and words that could be used to represent patience, there are actually two distinct words that are used almost interchangeably throughout the New Testament. And both of them have been translated as patience, patientia,
mm,
into the Latin. But the one has the connotation of um, not being angry. Long in the temper is the literal translation of it. So long suffering, right?
mm,
And the other one has the idea of being willing to wait and managing ambition, right? And I think it's interesting because I don't know how better you could define the two distinct meanings of the word patience, and they used them both. They felt that they were both applicable to the character of God and what we ought to be as His followers. Um, and so, anyhow, the long suffering piece is interesting because willingness to suffer was obviously big to them. That should continue to be a hallmark of Jesus' followers, right? Take up your cross and follow me. But this thing of managing ambition, I think that's more where this fear comes in of laziness and indifference and whatnot. But this is one interesting point I didn't mention before. Tertullian, on his treatise on patience, said that he believes the work of the Holy Spirit in a believer's life is predicated on their embrace of patience. And if they start to live in an impatient way, that the Holy Spirit will get uncomfortable and leave. And
Well,
so, and Tertullian
mm,
he was very interested in the work of the Holy Spirit. He was a very charismatic believer, so to speak. But that was his understanding of the nature of being a spirit-filled person and living a spirit-filled life. And so when you think then about, and you connect then with this idea of we do not speak great things, but we live them. Um, and you take that to our context where,
mhm.
you know, Christianity moved to America and became an enterprise, right? So we have embraced many ideas about the church that pose it as a high pressure sale. We really have to do this. We have to compel people and convince them and use words. And in contrast, this is describing something that I think the world is actually a lot more hungry for and ready for, which is lives that are deeply transformed, spirit compelled to live great things rather than speak them. And that's not an impassionate vision of what believers ought to be. Rather, there's every reason both to get excited and to be very sobered by that challenge.
Yeah, there's on page 259 of this book, in this idea of patience, this quote says, "Religion cannot be promoted by compulsion. The advocates of a religion must make their case by patience. When people seek to defend a religion by bloodshed and torture, the religion is polluted and outraged." And so I think of, in this current moment in the United States, we sit, what is it, 15, 16 days away from the national election for a president. And there is a sense of urgency everywhere. I mean, I'm getting texts on my phone to get out and vote. When you drive into downtown State College, there's a big truck with a big digital sign sitting right there by the street, trying to capture as many students as possible, and with saying, "Go vote, here, scan this QR code." There's a sense of urgency in our world, and a sense of compulsion. Obviously, at the end of the day, at the bottom of the ballot box is a gun. There is a sense of force. There is a very forceful reality, and so we've been raised. All four of us, I believe, have been raised in a churches that understand this idea of separation of church and state, of non-resistance, of a lot, of this understanding of we never force anybody. However, much has bled in. Much of this impatience, maybe we're not going to vote. I know that none of us are going to vote at November 5, but what other things have we soaked up in our Western world that are totally counter to the ways of Jesus and his kingdom and his church? And that's what I find. And I think that, this spirit of patience, this heart, this desire, this embracing of this virtue really convicts me, because I am the opposite of that. So great challenge. Thank you, Kevin. Any quick questions for Kevin yet before we move on here? We'll circle back to this idea, I'm sure, many times. Any more questions? Any from you all? The rest of you? Okay, so let's turn right. Let's move on to Wendell here, and Wendell's gonna be talking about habitus. So, what in the world does the word habitus mean? And also, maybe before we jump into that, tell us a little bit about what this book has meant to you, or why you think it's important.
Yes. Well, I'm excited to be here talking about this book too. So, Patient Ferment of the Early Church. I heard this book being discussed for probably 2 years before I read it, and I thought that I had the impression this was going to be a dry academic book. Well, I cracked it open, and as I told one of my brothers here at church, it's like, I thought this book was going to be boring. This is really interesting. I'm really enjoying it. So I would just encourage you all to, if you're thinking about reading this book, it's very worthwhile. It's very engaging, as someone said before, and I think if you're someone who's excited about following Jesus and what that means for your life, you'll find it very fascinating. I think it can really shake your world in a good way, and challenge maybe some of your preconceptions. But I want to talk about the idea of habitus. Now, that's not a word that many of us use, and probably not real familiar with the idea of what it means. So to introduce that in page 39, which is in the chapter Push and Pull, which a lot of what I'm going to refer to is from that chapter in the book. Near the beginning of the book, I think it's the second or third chapter. He talks about the fact that we often tend to think that we do things because of our ideas, like because of what we believe. We think we I think, therefore I am. We believe things, and that's why we act out of it. And he's pushing on that idea a little bit to say that actually the things that we do shape who we are, and I think can actually shape what we believe. And he talks about this idea of habitus, which is a really big a big idea, I think, that comes out in this book. And I think here on page 49 has a good statement, I think, of what it is. And that is that it is distinctive, reflexive, and embodied expression of the faith. And Brian, earlier you referred to it as embodied
behavior.
Behavior, right? But so he says it's a distinctive, reflexive, and embodied expression of the faith, especially for as Christians. And if you think of words that sound similar to this, you might think of habit or habitual, and there's definitely related ideas going on there. And it has a lot to do with like the way of life, the way we live, the way Christians live. And there's a quote here from page 51 that I thought was really powerful. And he says here, this is actually coming after a quote by Justin Martyr, and he's referring to Justin Martyr and Tertullian, and how they are talking about martyrs and people that suffered for their faith. And he says that it was not primarily what the Christians said that carried weight with outsiders, but it was what they did and embodied that was both disconcerting and converting. It was their habitus, their reflexes and ways of life that suggested there was another way to perceive reality that made the Christians interesting, challenging, and worth investigating. So I really like the way he puts that. Their way of life was what made them stand out. And that's what I took that definition of habitus as being distinctive, a distinctive expression of faith. And that's what I see here, especially when Christians were dying for their faith, and the pagans were looking on and saying, what's going on here? There's something odd, there's something unusual, distinctive, and worth investigating. And ultimately, that it was part of what drew the pagans into becoming followers of Jesus. There's also a quote, and maybe I don't want to go to that right yet, but he also talks about about habitus being a reflexive way of life. And so when I think of reflexes, I think, that thing where you do the knee jerk, where the doctor taps you on right below the knee there, below your kneecap, and you have your reflex kicks in. And it's like a reflex is something that is you don't really even think about because it's built into who you are. And it's built and in our bodies, it's actually part of our nerves and the way our nerves are wired, that it doesn't have to go back to the thinking part of us to actually engage, because it's what we do almost automatically. And so he's using this in a way of saying that the habitus is something that's reflexive. So I go to page 59. There's a quote that I like as well. I think this is from Tertullian. Oh, yeah. Tertullian says he's comparing. Kreider is comparing the Christian assembly to pagan private associations, and he says Tertullian, he uses a quote from Tertullian. He says, "We are from among yourselves," Tertullian exalts. "Christians are made, not born."
Hmm.
So, and that kind of actually, it feels like it's maybe fighting against the idea of reflexive, that it's the reflexes that are kicking in. But what Tertullian is saying, Christians are made, not born. Yeah, there is this rewiring that needs to happen, and that this transformation that needs to happen to take us from being pagans to being little Christ, like Jesus. And that's, whether we're in the first century or the 21st century, that's a reality that we all need to grapple with. We do need to be rewired. The transformation and rewiring needs to happen. So yeah, I'm doing a lot of quotes here, but I just found them really powerful. On page 143, this is in the chapter of catechesis and baptism. This is also in the idea of transformation, and he's kind of loosely quoting from Justin Martyr's apology. He says, "Christians have renounced their old habitus or way of life, and entered an alternative life-giving habitus in each of four areas that are very basic areas of society: in sex, continence; in place of magic, dedication to God; in wealth, bringing what we have into a common fund and sharing with everyone in need; in violence and xenophobia, living together and praying for our enemies and trying to persuade those who unjustly hate us. This new habitus," Justin contends, "is rooted in the teachings of Christ, whose word was the power of God." So I think that is a powerful picture of how the change, the transformation that happens to make this habitus reflexive. And he also says it's embodied. Okay, so there's Alan points out that the early Christians here did not use their meetings, their assemblies, or whatever you want to call it, assemblies, worship services. They did not use them as evangelistic tools. In fact, often, from what we can tell, pagans were kept out, and they were intentionally, partly because of the fear of persecution, but they didn't use it there was no such thing as seeker friendly services. And so he says in page 61, "What the outsiders saw was not their worship, it was their habitus." According to Tertullian, the outsiders looked at the Christians and saw them energetically feeding poor people and burying them, caring for boys and girls who lacked property and parents, and being attentive to aged slaves and prisoners. They interpreted these actions as a work of love. And I think this is kind of what for me really got my attention. They interpreted these actions as work of love, and they said, "Vide," let's Latin, look how they love one another. They didn't say "Aude," listen to the Christian's message. They did not say "Lege," or read what they write. And he makes a point that hearing and reading were important, but the most powerful way the early Christians impacted the pagan society around them was by them looking on and seeing what's happening. The Christian's truth, we must not miss the reality. The pagans said, "Look, Christianity's truth was visible, it was embodied and enacted by its members, it was made tangible, sacramental." And he says, some people, a minority in society, no doubt, but a small number that was growing, were drawn by this habitus, and they want to know, why is it that you live like this? So yeah, sorry. Yeah, and we have other places where this comes up. He talks about the way the way Christians actually cared for people during plague in Carthage. He refers to that, and I referred to that in the last quote too. But yeah, that to me, this whole idea of habitus and way of life that's reflexive. Sorry, that's what was the first one? It's distinctive. It stands out. It's reflexive, and it's because it's something that's learned. That's a action that's learned, reaction that's learned, and it's embodied. It's something that's actually a part of who we are in our bodies. Yeah, that's powerful. Do you have any thoughts or questions?
I have two questions for you, Wendell. The one is, do you have any comments on anything that stood out to you in terms of how habitus was formed by the early churches? What approach they took to that? And the second question is, do you have anything more to say about it being embodied? I think you already touched on this, but I was just wondering if you had anything even more explicit to talk about what does that mean for a habitus to be in your body, so to speak, this habitual distinctive thing that is almost part of your physicality.
Mm-hmm.
So to speak.
Yeah. So talking about the time that they took to bring people into this Christian community, what stood out to me was the fact that they recognized that this is not something that you flip a switch and all of who you are changes overnight. When we think that what we believe is the only thing that affects who we are, or maybe the primary thing that affects who we are. We think that when we change our minds about something, or have a different, or gain a different perspective on something, that automatically changes everything. And we don't realize that we're people that we live in bodies, and when our bodies are used to doing something, it actually takes time to change. And so I think that was what was kind of probably the biggest thing that stuck out to me on that. They actually realized that, yeah, it takes time for people to change from being pagans to being Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing on embodied, I guess I've heard someone else say this, something like, what the hands do, the heart believes, or maybe it's the heart eventually believes. I'm not sure if I inserted that in or if that was there originally. But that's powerful idea to me, and I kind of, that's rolled around in my head for years. But what we do actually shapes who we are. Now, I know that when you hear that, you might be thinking of, but I know people who do things that say something about them, but when you actually get to know them better, you find out that that's not actually who they are. Well, yeah, we do see that. I mean, that's hypocrisy, right? But when your heart is where it should be in following Jesus, there's something powerful about actually doing things that you maybe don't feel at the moment. There's things that we practice, like maybe it might be feet washing. It might be the holy kiss. It might be the bread and wine of communion, that actually shape us in powerful ways that I think we often don't realize. And maybe that's pretty vague, but that's what I got for right now on that.
Mm-hmm. Did you say feet washing too?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. And interestingly, the kiss of peace, Kreider talks about that.
Right. Yeah.
The early church writings, that was huge. That kiss of peace was huge, which right here. I grabbed one of their quotes here. The kiss of peace also shaped Christian witness. Believers, many of them poor, emerged from worship with exhilarating knowledge that they had kissed unequals on the level. I, a struggling stoneworker, had kissed a decoran, which is I think I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but which is a Roman official. Whatever others might say about them, the believers knew that they were people of worth, brothers and sisters in Christ. They knew this in their bodies. Outsiders would look at them and wonder what had happened to them in worship that gave them dignity and confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that amazing? So
Yeah.
in that community, those kingdom communities, there was like this presence of heaven or this kiss of heaven there. And yeah, they were brothers and sisters. They were eating at the same table, slaves, the bottom rung of society with the top rung of societies were meeting together, eating together, communing together, worshiping together, and they also gave each other that kiss of peace. And I think that's so powerful. I think the holy kiss is we sometimes call it, which is as a biblical term, or the kiss of peace or the kiss of charity, is really an amazing testament of brotherhood. I want to see us as a church fight for that. And again, we see that being a central part of these early Christian communities. Back to your, and I should say, continue with the embodiment idea. Jesus taught that in the sermon. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Okay, so do that embodied thing, that physical thing. Put your treasure, give it away. Invest it in the kingdom, and there your heart's going to be too. So it's amazing reality. Of course, John D. Martin has taught that so much. So yeah. Any more questions on this? This really, really important part, this embodiment idea. It's kind of taking this virtue of patience and putting it into practice.
Right.
Hector, speak up here. You've been pretty quiet. What happened to you? Have you been are you being patient with us?
I'm being patient with you. No, the habitus thing is really it's kind of a weird term, but I think it's pretty interesting on a lot of levels. One of the things that we are taught, I've been taught all my life, that I grew up with, that I find really astounding with the habitus concept, is that we're expected to change overnight. To be a new man, it's just going to be, and we're a new man. But wow, the early Christians didn't believe that at all. It just really messes with my worldview. So yeah, I'm not sure how to think about that, but I guess it's the historical record is there.
Yeah.
Right.
One other comment I would make on this subject of habitus, I was very provoked by the YouTuber Useful Charts after he had finished this grandiose exploration of the development of Christian denominations, and he surveyed all these different denominations and made this huge family tree of all of these different Christian groups and what inspired them and how they developed and whatnot. He was then asked to do a similar project with Judaism, and he himself is a convert to Judaism. And so he said, I'm going to begin by talking about the differences that I see between Christianity and Judaism at the beginning of this project. And he said the primary difference between Christianity and Judaism is that Christianity is concerned with what you believe. Judaism is concerned with what you do, how you live your life. And I thought, isn't that such a tragedy that after studying the breadth and length and depth of Christian groups that exist across the globe today, he was able to make that kind of assessment with such confidence. And I think it just underscores, in an anecdotal sort of way, the need for the church to recapture a passion for habitus.
Yeah, we could stay here a long time on this, but I guess, hey, these are all little teasers for our listeners to get the book, read it, and contemplate on some of these profound truths. And really, what's interesting, Wendell and Kevin and Hector, is that there is Christian leaders who are really thinking about this. They're just seeing this impoverishment among their churches, and they're realizing, whoa, what is happening? How can we help our people actually have a conviction and have a way of life that can sustain them in the face of a world that is so pluralistic, that is so post-Christian, and they're realizing just in the head isn't enough. It needs to embody you. It needs to be a reflexive, right, Wendell?
Right.
Like you just do it. You just do it. It needs to be ingrained in us. And I think of John Mark Comer and some of those who are really putting a lot of thought into discipleship and how people can slow down. Okay, become patient, slow down, and spend time with their communities, spend time in the Word, spend time with Jesus, so that they can actually have the sustenance they need to be faithful in our day. So yeah, it's these ancient people. They're teaching us today how to do that, and that's amazing. Super amazing. Okay, so I think Hector, Wendell gave you a little bit of a kind of stole your thunder, maybe even on your part of this time, and that is
Sorry.
that's okay. We'll just say you did a great lead in there for Hector to talk about their Sunday gatherings. So talk to us about that a little bit. What were those like, and is there anything that we can learn from them today?
So I got into this book by someone continually nagging me and finally giving me the book to read, because he said, if I'm writing a book, I got to read this book. So I read it, and actually, you guys are saying it's not a dry read. Now, I would differ a little bit. I don't really like reading academic stuff. So it is a little bit more of a weight than, it's definitely not a light read by any means. I've chewed on thicker paper, but there's definitely a lot in there. So, but I did really enjoy it, because it was one of those things that kind of really just, every time you turn a page, you're just not sure if you're going to get whacked on the side of the head with another weird idea. I read David Brousseau for the first time when I was probably 15. I didn't really pay much attention. So I'm not unfamiliar with the early church, but Alan Kreider's way of documenting and bringing out just and kind of making some things that we don't usually think about just really stick out. One is the Saturday gathering. It was actually Saturday evening that they would gather for worship and for communion. They would gather after work, late Saturday evening, come together for a meal, a time of sharing, and a time of praying. And then they would end this time with communion or the Eucharist. which I find the order interesting.
Hector,
Yes.
before you get into that, are you sure it was Saturday evening?
Sorry. It was Saturday evening because I was yeah, anyway. Yeah, it was Saturday evening. Now,
But there is documentation of Sunday evening, like it went to that first day of the week.
um this is what Alan
I
Kreider is
mean,
saying.
the Jewish communities would have, kind of had that the Sabbath, would have observed that, um, and then, but it pretty quickly, once it began to be Gentiles in the church, it went to a Sunday evening, or after work,
So,
or early in the morning. Which anyhow, but yeah, I thought that was pretty
okay.
clearly laid out in the book as well, but I could be wrong on that.
No, it's actually pretty clearly laid out as Saturday evening, which I thought was odd. Anyway,
Yeah.
one of those things kind of whacked me on the side of the head. But I mean, that aside, like whether it was, I'm pretty sure it was Saturday, but there may have been Sunday instances too. You guys can good excuse to read the book and figure that out. But
It's been a little while since I read that,
um,
that part, so I'll go. You go. I just thought maybe I was catching you with the wrong day there.
that's the way I understand it. But I'm not a scholarly type, so possibly I missed some details there. But that's what I understand. They met Saturday evening. There's several really interesting things about the way they met. One was they did not allow, like Wendell already said, they did not allow pagans to attend their service. That was not allowed. Now there were pagans that would, some churches, as long as the pagan would say, I believe, and want to become a catechumen or a disciple, they would allow that person to attend the service, but they would have to leave before the prayers and the communion. So they could attend the feast, they could be there for the prophecies, the testimonies, the preaching, but then they had to leave for the prayers and for the communion, which I think is fascinating. Like to me, it's just a wild new world. Like what kind of church service could that have been? And really gave me a longing to experience that. Like I think that to me sounds like the depth of their prayer times. There's writings of their prayer times being, the having to the president or the person leading the service having to calm down the prayers, because this was not a time when somebody would go pray and then everybody else would listen. This was everybody praying as they felt led, all at the same time. And some of them were trying to yell louder than the others to be heard better. I'm not sure what all was happening. They also asked them so they need to only raise their hands so far and not be wild about it. So there's definitely some Pentecostal leanings there in the early church, which to me is just, it sounds fascinating. It sounds great. I've been in a lot of conversations with people that talk about, we need to go back 20 years, we need to go back 40 years, we need to go back 60 years. I have a friend that went back to the Amish, the older Amish, because he said, he just wants to go all the way back to the beginning. But hey, I want to go all the way back to the first 100 years. Let's try that. Like let's just skip all the intern. It sounds really good. There's also some tough stuff there. Like I don't understand why they kicked out even those disciples. They asked them to leave for the community. Well, actually, they would have had a part of their service was the Holy Kiss, so they would have had a time in the service when they would have practiced that with each other. And there again, some groups practice this with only amongst the same genders, and some practice it across both, which have very weird, very outside my culture by a long shot. So as the church, after the Saturday evening service, that could be a fairly long service. The Sunday morning service, they would gather before daybreak because most of the people had to work on Sunday. So they would gather before daybreak and they would have prayers and a sermon. And this prayers and a sermon was just kind of like a prayer time. They mostly gathered for prayer and just a scripture reading and a short sermon. I saw that some of those, almost none of these sermons were recorded, but 6 to 15 minutes were the ones that were recorded, somewhere in that range, between 6 and 15 minutes. And another interesting thing about that was that there's record of the day laborers pleading with the preachers to cut back on their preaching because they need to get to work. So it's really interesting. It's definitely worth a read. Definitely worth shaping. I mean, it's really given me a desire to know, to live more like the first Christians did. And I know we can romanticize that period, and that can become a god in itself too. But I'm going to say definitely worth a read, definitely worth considering, and I would definitely like to see the church as a whole lean back that direction, especially for services. I've never been much impressed with modern church services. They always seem like there's something wrong with them. So maybe there's your answer. I don't know. There's my answer.
Mm-hmm. There's this little diagram. I was gonna share my screen, but I can't do that. You're the host there, Hector, for some reason.
So sorry.
But anyhow, so I won't try to have you figure that out. I'll just show it here.
Can't.
Let's see. There we go.
Right there. Yep.
So that's a graph showing to the right. I think it's your right, is a modern day, which is music and teaching, and a little bit of prayer, a little bit of table fellowship, and then the early church, split out more evenly there. So does that kind of capture what you think? I guess maybe I should say the apostolic church, really, Acts 2, is table and teaching, fellowship, prayer. It's more even. It's not this disproportionate amount with teaching or music. But yeah, does that kind of capture a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. With the table being a big part of the service, we often think, well, I mean, that's the way we practice it here at State College, is we actually have a meal with our service, thanks to Bryant being very adamant about that. Thank you, Bryant. And that has really, I always thought of it just being, we're going to eat together before the service, but no, that is part of the service.
Amen. That is part of the service. Yes. Mm-hmm. So they had services, but but you weren't allowed to be part of that if you weren't part of the church. Yeah, I've said as I've read that book, it's like whatever the Western church is doing, just think the opposite, and that's what the early church did. Isn't that something?
So, kind of at the intersection of your topic, Wendell, and your topic, Hector, is this idea of catechesis, correct? Because there are people coming into the church and they do get in at some point, but they have to go through this metamorphosis ahead of time. Do either of you have anything more to comment about that? It seems like, Hector, some of the things that are easy to romanticize about the way that they did worship was this idea that the people that were participating were fully vested, fully engaged, fully initiated, if you will. And so this concept or this need for catechesis seems to be evoked pretty early on in considering if the church is going to lean in this direction, what is that going to look like, or what will that need to look like?
That's a great question. Like, what would that look like? I used to read through Acts and read the where the eunuch riding the chariot through the desert, and he says, "Here is water. What hinders me to be baptized?" And sometimes I would just for kind of a joke slip in there. Well, then they went through 6 months of instruction class, and then he went and got baptized. That's not the way it reads, but
right.
Pretty early on, the church did that. I mean, 3 years, up to 3 years, not always. I mean, it was evidently very situational. Whenever your sponsor thought you were ready, then you could go to get baptized. And that was dependent upon your sponsor, or the person that was working closely with you, to decide when you were ready. And part of that was to keep potential pagans or traitors out of the church, because they were always trying to be the government. Somebody was always trying to infiltrate the church. And this is the way to keep them out. So fear of persecution was driving some of that.
Mm-hmm. But there also seems to be this onboarding, for lack of a better term.
Right. Obviously.
It's like preparing you for what you're going to experience, that is going to be fairly significant and different and immersive compared to what you've had up to this point.
Yeah.
Gives us a lot to think about.
Right. Yeah. One thing that I find interesting with that catechesis process, the way they did the sponsor, they had a catechumen would be sponsored by someone who was in the church, by a Christian. Yeah, like I think Hector, or you referred to, this whole thing of the 3 year or up to 3 year catechesis is kind of, it kind of rattles my categories, or breaks my categories of how I think. But it's fascinating, and I think it really ought to make us think about how we can make this, like how we can do, like Hector says, lean towards the early church.
Sure.
At least.
And one reality is that we're moving into a very pluralistic postmodern world, and people just do not understand the Christian language. And so, just as it was for the early church that was pagan, this was such a new thing, the same way it is for us today. And so I think there's a sense of like much patience will be needed, much teaching, much one-on-one life, to have them understand and gain this habitus, the Christian habitus, where somebody who was raised kind of in 60 years ago, 50, 20 years ago, would have a sense of kind of a Christian worldview, at least what it maybe should be in ways, and that's being lost today. And so that's something that is very applicable for our day, I think. Kevin, you're going to say something.
Well, I'm poking at you, but I think it's funny how your commentary there started with the language of the Christians and having the right ideas, and then you quickly shifted over to habitus. So, I mean, it just illustrates how we're wrestling with these ideas, right?
Right.
Because what is primary? So anyway.
Yeah, well, we probably should move towards wrap up here. Any more thoughts? Thank you, Hector, for top of the worship service. We hope that was a kind of a very practical area that's quite different than us. Did they have a specific attire for their Sunday gatherings, Hector?
That's another thing that fascinates me about the early church is their disorganization. Like, to me, that is one of the most beautiful things that I see is their lack of organization, their lack of organized mission effort, and yet they're growing in enough volume where I think the sponsor idea would have came into where it was, you couldn't have only the
Sure.
elders
Mhm.
teaching people because they couldn't reach around.
Right.
So yeah, no. As far as I can tell, there was. I mean, definitely they did care about attire. They did care about what they wore every day, but yeah, it was after dark on Saturday nights or before daylight on Sunday morning, so you couldn't see what they're wearing anyway, probably.
They had a lot of gas lights there, brother. All right, that's interesting.
No, they didn't.
Oil, okay, so wait, sorry, oil lamps.
Yeah, there we go. Propane lanterns.
Okay, all right. Well, my part here was to talk about ferment, and I'll just quickly read a paragraph or two here. Fermentation, this is on page 73. Fermentation is an intriguing process. It is gradual. Except for a stray bubble that emerges now and then, nothing seems to be happening. Until late in its operation, it is unimpressive. And yet it has a cumulative power that creates and transforms. As Michael Pollan, who writes insightfully about food, observes, a ferment generates its own energy from within. It not only seems alive, it is alive. And most of this living takes place at a scale inaccessible to us without a microscope. So it was with the early Christianity. On the plane of emperors, senates, and legionaries, Christianity was a minor superstitio. To the people who mattered, it was of little significance. And yet, for those with eyes to see and intuitions to perceive, a new energy was emerging, something reticently alive and inexorably in operation. And we could go on here and talk about this, but really, this ferment is this idea of a faithful presence, this non-anxious, faithful presence that James Hunter talks about in his book "To Change the World." Or there's this language of just living in front of people, of doing life. The church in Pittsburgh, and one of their visions is community as mission, right? It's this city on a hill idea, living in front of people, living out the kingdom, having communities that smell of heaven, and allowing that to be what woos and brings people in. And that's really, really what this was about. And interestingly, how did this ferment go out and spread? Well, through ordinary Christians. And it says, lay Christians traveled to new areas and established churches. What caused ordinary Christians to get involved in this? Often it was work. Christians found their business opportunities or the imperatives of their jobs by moving from their home areas to new areas as merchants, artisans, doctors, prisoners, slaves, and so on. And actually, by the third century as soldiers, which what's interesting is I have a book here. We actually have it on the store now called Caesar and the Lamb by George Calantis. We hope to interview him, but he has done a ton of work on this idea of non-resistance in the early church, and combing through all this information and kind of a growing body of information on the early church concludes that the church up to into the third century was clearly non-resistant. And it may be at a fast reading of the early fathers, some people say, well, it's simply accepted, soldiers or those who maybe didn't go out and fight, but were kind of part of the army in some way. But there's a sense of that it's clear that was outside of what they wanted to be part of. And so, yes, and as they traveled, they often moved in existing networks of family and profession and faith, taking their faith with them. And in new places, they found Christian cells. One scholar has called this process migration missions. And so that's how the ferment happened. It moved out in just very ordinary ways, no fancy plans, No fancy church strategies. Just we'll move over here and start my business here. So that's how the church spread. So I just this idea is so inspiring to me, and I just deeply desire to see our churches today doing that same, starting cells, right? In other places. It might be small, and that's how they were. Like Keith Kreider in his book said, they were all over the empire, but they were small communities that grew, not quickly, but they passionately grew. And as one person points out, and I think he actually does in this book, actually, Alan does, he says that, you know, these weren't Christians who were bringing in, by tens and hundreds in their lifetime, new Christians. They say on average, one Christian saw one convert in his life. But can you imagine the growth of that? And could you imagine today if just within the Anabaptist churches, okay, we all would see one, every member would be on duty, striving to reach out and finding those who are hungry and discipling them and teaching them. Could you imagine one convert, what that would do in our churches? And so it wasn't this tremendous growth, but it was a steady growth that we see happening. Any thoughts there on this idea of ferment before we wrap up?
I like the idea of ferment because it doesn't, it takes a long time. It's hard to really tell that something's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you see some bubbles, but especially if you're making like a yeast or something, it takes a little bit for it to happen. But boy, when it gets happening, all of a sudden you don't realize the exponential growth starts very, very slowly at first, but as it goes out, it becomes pretty apparent. I think the ferment word is a great word to use there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely just helps you understand what does it look like for me, for our church here in State College, or for in York with Kevin's, or Wendell's in Pittsburgh. What does it look like? Well, it's just a faithful presence, right? It's every day, living that, embodying the kingdom of God on earth to those around us, and praying that through our lives we could see people move from darkness to light.
So I'll throw something out that
Mm-hmm.
is a big enough conversation that I know we don't have enough time for it here, but maybe we can
Come
tease
back
it.
to it. All right.
So I think one of the predicaments that we face, Hector already teased towards this idea of pulling back the curtain, and let's go back and try to recapture some of this. So along with what I said about the useful charts presentation and the state of where the church is today, I think we do really need to grapple with this thing of schism in the church and what that's done to us, and where that was often precipitated on impatience in our reality. And
Sure.
And I think we really need to grapple with where that drops us off in the grand scheme of things. To poke fingers at someone else for a moment in a very non-introspective move, I'll just talk about, say, the restorationist movement. It's very interesting how the restorationist movement started out with this idea of recapturing the spirit of the early church and unifying all Christians. And it didn't take very long into the movement until that group itself started splintering and, splitting into a lot of different groups. And I just think it's such an interesting place where we find ourselves. So we do have this very big family tree. There are all of these different groups inside of our own faith tradition, outside of our faith tradition. And I continue to grapple with this question of, if the church is really going to recapture any of this patience, how is that going to apply to how ought it apply to the messes that we've made through our impatience? I guess that's the short way of asking the question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that's a big question, and something that we can definitely stew on and let ferment for some time. I just recently having a conversation with someone, and we were talking about how it's so easy to find the things that are wrong, right, around us, but trying to find those things that are good, and building on those things. And I believe that we have those things around us in our churches and in our Anabaptist faith tradition that we can build on. Sure, there's things that aren't the best, but there's a lot that are, and so to build on that, I think can be grounding, and can give us the ability then to move forward in a way, and give us some alignment in a sense.
So I agree with you, Brother Bryant. Absolutely. And my intention isn't to sling mud, but I think my question comes down to, it's enamoring. It really is enamoring how
Okay.
you have a group of believers like this who at the inception of the church are embracing this paradox of what the church ought to be, and it's very impressive, like a ferment in its results. But we've also proven in the 2,000 years since that it is possible to cultivate some very, very insular Christian communities that are not they're not just patient. It would seem that they actually might be lethargic.
Sure.
Certainly not growing. There's certainly, just an insulation, right? So I think especially in the Anabaptist
Wow.
tradition, we wrestle with that
Sure.
of the tradition, and rightfully so. And when we look at the patient ferment of the early church, it's both
Right.
compelling, it's provocative, it's scary. But it forces us to ask the question, I think, so is there something that we're missing here? That's perhaps the way that I would reframe that. Is there something that we're missing? Because in many ways there are aspects of the Anabaptist faith tradition that have held on to this need for transformation and patience and a slow moving process. But I think there's some stagnation that has crept in, and my current thesis is that that's probably mostly due to how readily we've embraced schism, because schism actually is not the embodiment of patience. It actually is using tools on the church that were not meant to be used. So anyway,
It's probably also due to lack of proper worship, because the worship service being participatory and like the early church would have had, as it quickly became much more sterile. By 250, 300, it was becoming very sterile. I think that would have something to do with it. Your ability to, it's hard to stagnate when you worship properly.
Yeah. It's a good reminder. I appreciate that.
And I wonder too. So I thank you for putting on your prophet hat there, Kevin, and pushing into that. I appreciate that. And earlier today, I was reading this article about um, Orthodox Jews and some of the interaction with the Amish. Even though at a glance they look a lot the same, but this Jewish person went on to say that how different they are than the Amish, and that is, and he pointed out some areas, and I found it fascinating. In a sense, he was saying that the Amish are kind of stuck to a tradition and they don't even know how to explain it, what it is. And he said that's not how we are. We can explain it. We can articulate it, the why of why we do these things. And I found it really, it was very thought provoking. How true, I'm not sure, but as I read that, I thought of this quote by a rabbi out of John Mark Comer's book, Live No Lies. And he says this, he said, to become a creative minority is not easy because it involves maintaining strong links with the outside world while staying true to your faith, seeking not merely to keep the sacred flame burning, but also to transform the larger society which you are a part. This is, as Jews can testify, a demanding and risk-laden choice. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. I just love that. This seeking to be a creative community, acknowledging that you will be a minority, okay? Being okay with that. But at the same time, so keeping that sacred flame burning, but at the same time, not defending, not making that lane longer, not building up higher walls, but stepping forward, and having those strong links with those around you. As Jesus said, in the world, but not of the world. And I wonder, this idea of this of defending, but yet the polemics, apologetics and polemics, stepping forward, taking our faith, being the city on a hill, being vulnerable, not being, as Gary Miller points out in his book, in Matthew 25, not being hole diggers, but being investors in the world around us, not being defensive, being offensive. I don't know. Is that some of our issue of our day in our churches? We become lax, satisfied, status quo. I don't know. You asked a big question, and I'll pause for a second to let you critique my my thoughts there.
Mm-hmm. I really like the quote that you read, by the way. That was very thought-provoking. I'm fascinated. Excuse me. I'm fascinated that for those of us that may find ourselves moving away from that more insular expression of faith. So yeah, we tend to get more involved in how we articulate things, and
Sure.
you know, the churches that are migrating away from the Amish also transform to a different kind of gathering, a different kind of worship, typically, where you exchange in some ways the table fellowship for the lecture hall, and I think that should give us a lot of pause. Is that really
Right.
the direction that this ought to go in? But yes, being a whole person is something that there's a lot to be said for. So we need to use our minds. We need to be able to understand our faith and why things matter. But certainly the embodiment is really where the rubber meets the road in so many ways. And so let's keep first things first and keep following Jesus.
Amen. Well, thank you, brothers, for this great time. I'll be contemplating on this as we for the next couple of days. And thank you for our listeners here. If you listen to Hood at the end, good job. If you have any thoughts as you read this book, please feel free to share it with us at Strength to Strength. Maybe you have some more questions, and maybe we'll get this circle back together, or maybe do a live talk where we can kind of think in public with some of these things. So, in wrap up here, I'm going to read a short book review by David Matthew, who actually has a blog with a bunch of the quotes from this book. And he says this. He said, Kreider's book is extremely well documented with prolific references to the writings of the early church of Christian leaders like Justin, Cyprian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Augustine, and others, some of whose long treatises on the subject of Christian patience. We can learn many lessons from the early church, and this book will highlight some of them. At the same time, our 21st century world is different in many ways, and we would not want to apply all of those lessons slavishly as the only way forward. This is one of the most fascinating and thought-provoking books I have read for a long time. If you are in any form of church leadership, you will find this particularly helpful. So thank you, David Matthew, whoever you are. I thought that would be a great way to wrap up this book review. And again, you can reach out to us at Strength to Strength via email or our website. Email is contact@strengthtostrength.org, or go to our website at strengthtostrength.org. And we also have a bookstore there. You can buy this book on the store. Again, thank you, brothers, for joining here, and God bless you all. Goodbye.